Courtney. Wonderful. So it's, as you've already heard, it's pledge season, stewardship season. And just like on NPR, you know, it's our favorite time of year, right? We all love it when we get to talk about this stuff. I'm going to try something a little different today. I think I've got much more material than I can cover today. So I'm going to set my timer for 12 minutes. And when it goes off, I'm going to try to wrap up and save anything else I had for next Sunday. And I think I'm not even going to get to the apples today. So the apples are just a teaser for next Sunday, I think. Okay, I'm starting my timer now. So the stewardship packets with a pledge card and a letter and some other materials will be going out from the church office tomorrow. So you'll probably get them near the end of the week. And so we're going to talk today about giving and generosity and how that relates to church. I have a lot of baggage on this issue that I need to tell you about before we start. My dad was really grumpy about church. He was really sour on church for some reason. I never quite figured out why. But one of his chief complaints was that the church just wants your money. The church is always asking for money. The church always has their hand out. And I internalized that somehow. And I don't even know why he felt that way. Like, what was it that turned him on to those kinds of feelings? It was even to the extent that at one point after I went to college, and I was the youngest, so all of us were out of the house, he started volunteering for Habitat for Humanity. And we were all just amazed. We're like, this is the greatest thing. We're so happy that Dad's found this great organization to give to volunteer his time for. My dad was a general contractor, so it's just the kind of guy that Habitat for Humanity would love to have as a volunteer. And so he volunteered with them for a while, and then a little later we heard he had quit. We're like, Dad, why did you quit? He's like, oh, it turns out they're just a bunch of evangelical Christians. And he said he went to a meeting where they talked about the economics of Jesus, and that was too much for him. Now, if you know Habitat for Humanity, you know that their language about the economics of Jesus just means they're a nonprofit. That's all that it means. That's all they're saying with that. But he didn't like the combination of religion and money, and it just turned him off so much. And then I became a pastor. And I guess I showed him, right? No, you can talk to my therapist about that. But as a pastor, I've had to really work that out. All of this stuff that I'd internalized about money and church and giving, and then having to talk about it in an authentic way with integrity regularly in a church community. So the material that I want to share with you today and then maybe next Sunday is, after 25 years of working this out, this is kind of the principles that I've come up with for how I navigate and talk about and teach generosity and giving. To start with, we start with generosity, not with giving money, not even with general giving, but the practice, the value, the virtue of generosity, which I believe is one of the most basic fundamental virtues and practices of the Christian life. Even to the degree of saying that if we are not at least trying to be generous and cultivating generosity, I wonder what we're doing as Christians. Like, I think it's that basic to who we are. And let me back that up with some stuff from the Bible. The reason I say that it's so basic, that generosity is so basic, is because when Jesus was asked, what are the two greatest commandments? He looked at all of the Torah, of his knowledge of all of the Torah, and he took two commandments that were not close to each other in the Torah, and he combined them together. And he said, the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. And the second is like it. He didn't even just say the second. He said the second is like it. He connected them. Love your neighbor as yourself. So clearly love is a foundational principle of our faith. But then he went on in the Gospel of Luke to illustrate that principle with a story. And it was the story of the Good Samaritan. And as you know from the story of the Good Samaritan, the guy gets beat up and he's lying on the side of the road. And two respectable religious people each walk by one after the other and walk right by him and ignore him. And then a Samaritan, who in that time was considered an outsider, walks by and stops and bandages his wounds and cares for him, transports him to an inn, cares for him at the inn, pays the innkeeper to continue caring for him after he leaves, and says, if I owe you anything for extra care, I will pay it. So when Jesus goes to illustrate what love looks like, love of God and love of neighbor, he tells a story of radical generosity. He tells a story of extravagant giving to somebody in need. And then he puts a little twist on it at the end. He asks the person he's talking to, so who was a neighbor to this man? And the person says, it was the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. So I think those three virtues are all connected and intertwined and foundational. Love, generosity, and mercy. That's what basically we are called to practice as Christians. And then Jesus demonstrates generosity throughout his life. He leaves his home and his possessions and his family, and he travels around Palestine, and he gives lessons to people about how to love one another, and he heals people, even to the extent that he gets tired of healing people and wants to get off by himself, and they just keep following him, and he just keeps healing them. Even though he wants to stop, he keeps giving them of himself. And then if his teachings and his example in his life weren't enough, his death is sort of the ultimate example of his giving of his whole life to the world. So between his teachings and his life and his death, I think Jesus demonstrates to us the fundamental nature of generosity and what we are supposed to be cultivating as Christians. Following Jesus means growing in our generosity. Now, generosity is much more than giving money. Generosity is much more than giving to the church. We practice generosity in all areas of our lives in so many different ways. We can be generous by giving of our skills. So if there's something that we've practiced a lot that we're very good at, and we can offer it to others, we can do that with a generous heart and a generous spirit. We can be generous with our time. Sometimes people don't need our skills, they just need our presence. They just need our hands, and we can be generous with giving our time to others. We can be generous with kindness and affirmation and affection. One of my real good friends, colleagues, and mentors is named Leah. And Leah is just extravagant with her giving of praise and affirmation to others. It's her mission in life, I think, to lift people up and to tell people how wonderful they are and how kind they are and how talented they are. She'll even tell you how beautiful you are, which is like, you're not supposed to talk about people's looks anymore, right? But she was like, oh, you are so pretty. You are so handsome. You are such a strong-looking person. And it's so genuine that nobody complains, right? And so she's a great example of generosity of affirmation and kindness. We can be generous with our grace and our forgiveness. And that maybe we're not ready to forgive everybody, but we are always called to seek to be more gracious and more forgiving. There's somebody that we haven't forgiven, we're invited to pray about that and see if there's something can be moved in our heart towards greater forgiveness. We can be generous in our listening. We can be generous in conflict. We're butting heads with somebody. Can we find the grounding to give a little bit in that conflict and be generous in the conflict? We can be generous with our stuff, our house, welcoming people into our home for a meal or even to stay overnight. And our cars, we can be generous with our cars. Not everybody has a car. How does it feel to you to loan your car to somebody? Ooh, right? It might make you a little nervous. So that's an area where we might want to grow in our generosity. Are we willing to be generous with our stuff? St. Francis, in his prayer of St. Francis that we've all probably heard, talks about generosity, and maybe we didn't even think about it as generosity when we heard it the first time, but listen to it in the context of generosity. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Every line of that is about generosity. Generosity of our understanding, generosity of our consolation, generosity of our love. Now, generosity is also about money. And if something just twisted in your heart, like you were good with everything else I just said, like, oh yeah, generosity with listening, you're right, generosity with kindness and our time, preach it, Pastor Tom, right? But when I said generosity with our money, like some little window in your heart just boop. And that's because we in our culture have a weird relationship with money, that we probably treat money like a god. We probably worship money and comfort. Craig mentioned comfort. We probably worship money and comfort that money supplies as a false idol. And you know it's a false idol because you need to protect it. You don't need to protect God. God is love. God is the creator of the universe. God doesn't need to be defended. But a false god can be knocked over and broken. And if we have a false god like a relationship with money or comfort, we get defensive because no, I got to defend this God. This is my real God, and you better not touch it. So, the principle that one of the principles I want to talk about today is yes, that giving and generosity is about more than money, but it's also about money. It's also about how much we give to others and how generous we are with our money. And secondly, it's about more, when it comes to money, it's about more than giving to the church. And when I talk, and my timer is about to go off, so I'm going to wrap it up. When we talk about giving beyond just giving to the church, and I guess next Sunday is all about giving to the church, so come to that. I would include giving to nonprofits. So all the giving that we do, whether to an environmental organization or to somebody that helps the hungry, these organizations that do specific work that they're really good at and equipped for to help those who are most in need, that counts as our total, when we're considering our total giving, that counts. And the other thing that counts that we don't often think about and we don't often talk about is relational giving. Maybe you've even never heard of it referred to that way. Relational giving is when we give money to people that we know, that we have a relationship with. And this isn't like giving to your kids or your grandkids, but people outside of our immediate family. Maybe to a cousin, a distant cousin, maybe to somebody like that a little bit further in the family, but somebody who we know struggles. And maybe they shouldn't struggle. Maybe they're an addict. Maybe who knows what the issue is. And maybe we're not going to give to everybody in the family or every person we know. But there are people, maybe it's a neighbor who has a special need. Maybe it's a homeless person that you pass regularly, that you've started to develop a relationship with, you've learned their name. But the giving to people that we know, a 20 here, 100 there, somebody, a cousin needs $1,000, you don't say, I'm loaning you $1,000, you just give it. That counts. That's part of what a generous heart and a generous spirit looks like when it comes to giving. So when we talk next Sunday about the ways that we give to the church, we're going to look at the church in that context. And why is the church special? Why is it different? Why should it be maybe up near the top of our giving? But when we think about all the ways that we give, including our money and including evaluating our generosity to others, we're going to include our nonprofits, our relational giving, and our church. And it's all going to be in the context of nurturing a more generous spirit, because that is foundational and fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. Amen.